Barron Trump, the towering enigma of America's most polarizing dynasty, stumbled into the most astonishing, downright hilarious uproar imaginable. A clash so electrifying, so outrageously over the top, that it's already being hailed as the greatest controversy to ever rock the headlines. It erupted in an instant, a wildfire sparked by a fanatical Zelensky supporter whose obsession turned a routine day into a spectacle of pure madness. What unfolded was beyond extraordinary, a twist so wild, so utterly mind-bending, that it gripped the world in a frenzy of disbelief. Prepare yourself, because this tale of chaos and charisma will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about courage, confrontation, and the young Trump himself. The scene unfolded within the gleaming walls of a luxurious New York gym, a sanctuary of steel and sweat where the elite sculpted their bodies amid mirrored perfection. Barron Trump, now 18, strode through its doors with the quiet confidence of a man who'd outgrown the shadow of his famous lineage. Standing at an imposing 6'7", his frame was a blend of lean muscle and youthful vigor, honed by hours of relentless training. His dark hair fell slightly over his brow, dampened by exertion, while his piercing gaze swept the room with a calm that belied his years. Clad in a fitted black tank top and shorts, he moved with purpose, a private soul thrust into the public eye by choice. This time, for a charity fitness challenge aimed at raising funds for a veterans cause he'd quietly embraced. The gym pulsed with energy that day, its polished floors reflecting the glow of overhead lights as machines hummed and weights clanked in a rhythmic symphony. Members milled about Wall Street titans, fitness influencers, and a scattering of curious onlookers, drawn by the buzz of Barron's rare appearance. This isn't just a story, it's a revelation. And if you want to see how far it goes, subscribe now before it disappears. A massive banner stretched across one wall, proclaiming the event's noble intent, while volunteers darted through the crowd, collecting donations with eager smiles. The air thrummed with anticipation, a heady mix of exertion and goodwill, until a shadow crept into the frame, a figure whose presence would shatter the day's harmony like glass under a hammer. This figure was the Zelensky fan, a wiry man in his 30s whose intensity radiated like heat from a forge. His faded green jacket bore a Ukrainian flag patch, its edges frayed from countless rallies, a badge of his unyielding devotion. Known in obscure online circles as a relentless crusader, he'd spent weeks lurking in the gym's corners, his eyes tracking Barron with a predator's patience. His skin was weathered, his jaw set tight, a man fueled by a cocktail of righteous fury and personal grievance. Today, he'd chosen his moment, his anger simmering to a boil as he watched Barron lift weights with a focus that seemed to mock his own turmoil. Barron stood at the bench press, his hands gripping the bar as he hoisted an impressive load, his muscles flexing with each controlled repetition. Sweat beaded on his forehead, tracing paths down his temples, his breathing steady despite the strain. The gym-goers nearby offered nods of respect, some filming his form with discreet admiration, their phones capturing a young titan at work. The charity event unfolded around him. Trainers led warm-ups, a leaderboard tracked donations, but Barron remained an island of focus, his presence a quiet draw amid the orchestrated chaos. The Zelensky fan edged closer, his movements deliberate, a coiled spring ready to snap. His hands twitched at his sides, his chest heaving as he wove through the crowd, unnoticed by the distracted masses. He'd planned this confrontation, his mind a tangle of accusations. Barron's family, their politics, their perceived indifference to Ukraine's plight, all distilled into a venom he could no longer contain. As Barron set the bar back on its rack, sitting up with a slow exhale, the fan struck, bursting into the open space with a ferocity that turned heads. His arms flailed, his face flushed crimson as he thrust himself into Barron's orbit, his mouth moving in a silent torrent of rage, no words audible, only the raw energy of his outburst. He jabbed a finger toward Barron, his gestures wild and accusing, his eyes blazing with a zealot's fire. Gym-goers froze, their workouts abandoned as they turned to witness the unfolding drama, a ripple of shock spreading through the room. The fan yanked his phone from his pocket, thrusting it forward, its screen glowing with images. Perhaps war-torn streets, perhaps headlines, meant to wound, to provoke, to drag Barron into his crusade. Barron rose from the bench, his height unfolding like a banner, towering over the fan with a stillness that seemed to absorb the chaos. His face remained impassive, a mask of curiosity rather than anger, his blue eyes locking onto the man with an intensity that pierced through the frenzy. Sweat glistened on his skin, his tank top clinging to his frame, yet he stood as if untouched by the storm, a colossus amid the tempest. The fan's movements grew more frantic, his phone shaking in his grip as he pointed from the screen to Barron, his silent tirade escalating into a performance of pure desperation. The crowd thickened, drawn by the spectacle, their phones now raised in a forest of lenses, capturing every angle of the confrontation. Trainers hesitated, unsure whether to intervene, while security guards stirred at the room's edges, their hands hovering over radios. The Zelensky fan, sensing his moment slipping, grabbed a water bottle from a nearby rack, his fingers tightening around it as his frustration peaked. In a flash of reckless fury, he hurled it toward Barron, the plastic spinning through the air, a missile born of rage aimed at the young Trump's chest. Barron's reflexes kicked in, his body shifting with feline grace as he sidestepped the projectile. The bottle sailed past, its arc unbroken until it smashed into a treadmill behind him, the impact jarring the machine into a stuttering malfunction. Sparks flared from its console, a thin wisp of smoke curling upward as the belt jerked to a halt, a mechanical groan echoing through the gym. Panic flickered among the onlookers, a collective gasp rising as the scent of burning wires tinged the air, the threat of danger snapping the room into sharp focus. Without hesitation, Barron moved, his long strides closing the distance to the smoldering treadmill. He snatched a fire extinguisher from its wall mount, his hand steady as he yanked the pin and unleashed a blast of white foam, smothering the sparks in seconds. The smoke dissipated, the machine silenced, and the gym held its breath, the chaos stilled by his swift action. He set the extinguisher down, his posture relaxed yet commanding, his gaze sweeping the room as if to assure its safety, a quiet heroism etched into every line of his frame. The Zelensky fan stood rooted, his arms limp, the phone dangling uselessly in his hand as the reality of his blunder sank in. His face paled, his bravado crumbling under the weight of Barron's calm resolve and the crowd's shifting tide. Gym-goers erupted into applause, their cheers a rolling wave that drowned out the fans' silent defeat, their phones still rolling as the moment went live. Security surged forward, their boots thudding against the floor as they flanked the fan, guiding him toward the exit with firm grips, his head bowed in a mix of shame and defiance. Barron returned to the bench, wiping his hands on a towel, his expression unchanged, as if the incident were a mere interruption to his day. The charity event resumed, volunteers buzzing with renewed vigor, the leaderboard spiking with donations inspired by the drama. Outside, the fan slumped against the gym's glass facade, his breath fogging the pain as security released him with stern gestures. His phone buzzed with alerts, the video already viral, the world dissecting his folly and Barron's triumph. But he ignored it, his eyes fixed on the gym's interior, where Barron's silhouette loomed large. The footage spread like wildfire, clips of the bottle's flight, the treadmill's sparks, and Barron's extinguisher wielding saved dominating screens worldwide. Hashtags flared, #BarronHero, Gym Showdown igniting debates that split the internet. Some hailed Barron as a beacon of composure, others questioned the fans' motives, his actions branded reckless or righteous depending on the lens. The gym pulsed on, its rhythm restored, but the air carried a new charge, a story born in chaos that refused to fade. Barron finished his set, the weights clanking into place, oblivious to the storm now brewing beyond the walls. A storm that promised more collisions, more fire, and a legacy redefined by a single, explosive moment. Barron Trump stepped out of the cafe, the faint chime of the bell fading behind him as the cool evening air brushed against his skin. The streets of New York thrummed with their usual chaos, yellow cabs weaving through traffic, the chatter of pedestrians blending into a constant hum, and the occasional blare of a horn slicing through the dusk. He adjusted the cap pulled low over his brow, a futile shield against the recognition that now shadowed his every move. At 6'7", blending in had never been easy, but tonight, after the gym incident and the viral video that followed, it felt impossible. His long strides carried him forward, away from the cafe's fleeting sanctuary and toward the sprawling green expanse of the park in the distance, a place he sensed would soon become more than just a backdrop to his routine. The weight of the day pressed against him, a quiet tension coiling in his chest. The Zelensky fans' outburst replayed in his mind, the hurled bottle, the extinguisher's hiss, the crowd's stunned silence before the applause broke through. Barron had stayed calm, his response measured, but the encounter gnawed at him. It wasn't just the fans' aggression, it was the way it had spiraled outward, a single spark igniting a firestorm he couldn't control. His phone buzzed again in his pocket, more notifications, more opinions, more noise. But he kept it buried, unwilling to face the digital deluge just yet. As he walked, the city's pulse seemed to sync with his own, each step a beat in an unfolding rhythm. He passed a newsstand, the day's headlines screaming from the racks, though none yet bore his name. That would change soon enough. A group of college students lounged on a nearby bench, their laughter cutting through the air, phones in hand as they scrolled through the same feeds that now carried his image. One of them glanced up, squinting in his direction, and Barron quickened his pace, his eyes fixed ahead. The park loomed closer now, its trees silhouetted against the fading light, a quiet promise of solitude he doubted it could keep. Meanwhile, across town, the Zelensky fan stood at the edge of the gym's parking lot, his voice ringing out over the growing crowd. His green jacket, emblazoned with a Ukrainian flag patch, flapped in the breeze as he gestured with fervor, his words sharp and unrelenting. The small knot of supporters had swelled, activists with signs, onlookers drawn by curiosity, and a few diehards who saw in him a voice for their own frustrations. "Barron Trump thinks he can ignore us," he declared, his breath visible in the cooling air. "He thinks his name, his height, his privilege can shield him from the truth, but we're not here to be silenced." A young woman with a camera stepped forward, her lens trained on him as she nodded in agreement. "This needs to be bigger," she said, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "The park tomorrow, hundreds of us, not just a handful, will make them hear us." The fans' eyes gleamed, a flicker of triumph sparking within them. He'd tasted defeat in the gym, escorted out like a nuisance, but here, amid the rising cheers, he felt the tide turning. He turned to the crowd, raising a fist. "Tomorrow, we take it to the park. We show them what accountability looks like." The energy shifted, palpable and electric, as the group rallied around his call. A local news van idled nearby, its crew scrambling to set up as their camera lights bathed the scene in a harsh glow. The fan's speech grew louder, more impassioned, each word a brick in the foundation of his makeshift movement. "He can't hide from this," he shouted, his voice hoarse but unbroken. "Not from us, not from the world." The crowd roared, their phones aloft, live-streaming the moment to feeds that buzzed with hashtags and hot takes. The gym incident had been a flare. This was the fire. Back on the streets, Barron reached the park's edge, its wrought iron gates casting long shadows across the path. He paused, hands in his pockets, his breath steady but his mind racing. The conversation with Eric lingered, his brother's calm advice a lifeline in the storm, but it hadn't quelled the unease that churned beneath his surface. "Stay calm, don't engage, let it blow over." Sensible words, but they felt hollow against the reality unfolding around him. This wasn't just about one fan's outburst. It was about the collision of worlds, his quiet life against the clamor of a cause he hadn't chosen to fight. He stepped onto the grass, the soft crunch of leaves underfoot a stark contrast to the asphalt he'd left behind. The park stretched out before him, its paths winding through clusters of trees and benches, a few late joggers dotting the landscape. For a moment, he let himself imagine it as it had been a place to think, to breathe, to escape the weight of his last name. But tomorrow, he knew, it would transform. The Zelensky fan's voice, distant but insistent, seemed to echo in his ears, a harbinger of the chaos to come. Barron found a bench near a quiet pond, its surface rippling faintly under the evening breeze. He sat, his long legs stretched out, and finally pulled his phone from his pocket. The screen lit up, a cascade of alerts spilling across it, news clips, tweets, messages from friends and strangers alike. Barron Trump stays cool under pressure. Zelensky fanatic attacks Trump's son. What's next? Hero or villain? The gym showdown everyone's talking about. He scrolled, his expression unreadable, as the divide in the comments mirrored the whispers he'd overheard in the cafe, praise clashing with outrage, curiosity tangling with judgment. One message caught his eye, a text from an old friend, Jake, who'd known him before the spotlight grew so harsh. "Dude, saw the vid. You good? This guy's unhinged, watch your back." Barron's fingers hovered over the keyboard, a reply forming but not sent. He didn't need to confirm what he already felt. The fan wasn't done, and this was only the beginning. He pocketed the phone and leaned back, his gaze settling on the water, its dark surface reflecting the last streaks of daylight. Across the city, the Zelensky fans' rally dispersed, but its momentum lingered. The news crew packed up, their footage already streaming to screens far beyond New York, while the fan huddled with his core supporters, plotting the next move. "We need signs, megaphones, numbers," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Tomorrow's not just a protest, it's a statement." The young woman with the camera grinned, her excitement palpable. "I'll spread the word online. By morning, we'll have a crowd." The night deepened, the city settling into its restless rhythm, but for Barron and the fans, sleep would be elusive. Two forces, poised on a collision course, converged toward the park, a stage set for a showdown neither could fully predict. Barron rose from the bench, his silhouette stark against the pond's shimmer, and began the walk home, his mind steeled for what lay ahead. The storm was brewing, and tomorrow it will break. The park simmered in the aftermath of Barron Trump's departure, the air thick with the residue of shouted words and unmet expectations. The Zelensky fan stood by the pond, his chest heaving, the Ukrainian flag still draped over the bench like a battle standard. His green jacket was damp with sweat, his megaphone dangling from one hand as he stared at the path where Barron had vanished. The crowd around him buzzed, a restless hive of voices, some chanting his name, others arguing among themselves, their phones still aloft, feeding the moment to a ravenous online audience. The sun was higher now, its light slicing through the trees, illuminating the chaos. News crews adjusted their angles, reporters speaking rapidly into microphones about the escalating tensions and the unexpected clash. Drones hummed overhead, their lenses glinting like predatory eyes. The fans' supporters pressed closer, their signs bobbing in the air, "Justice for Ukraine." No more silence, while a smaller knot of Barron sympathizers lingered at the edges, murmuring about fairness and provocation. The park, once a haven of morning calm, was now a fractured arena, its grass trampled under the weight of hundreds of feet. The fan turned back to the crowd, his face a mask of defiance and exhaustion. He raised the megaphone, his voice hoarse but unbroken. "This isn't over," he declared, the words cutting through the clamor. He walked away, but he can't escape what's coming. None of them can. A cheer erupted from his core supporters, their fists pumping in solidarity, but the sound was jagged, undercut by boos and scattered shouts of dissent. The crowd was splitting, loyalties fraying as the reality of the confrontation sank in. Across the park, near the exit Barron had taken, a young woman in a blue coat lowered her phone, her live stream still running. "He didn't fight back," she said to her viewers, her voice tinged with surprise. "He could have, but he didn't. What does that mean?" Her comment section exploded, some praising Barron's restraint, others calling it cowardice. The video was already racking up thousands of views, each share amplifying the moment beyond the park's borders. Back by the pond, the fan paced, his energy restless, almost manic. He wanted a reckoning, a public unraveling of Barron Trump's composure, and he'd gotten closer than he'd expected. That shove, the brief stumble, the flash of anger in Barron's eyes, it had been a crack in the armor, a glimpse of something raw. But Barron's retreat had stolen the climax, leaving the fan with a victory that felt incomplete. He needed more. He needed Barron to break, to admit something, anything, that would justify the months of obsession, the sleepless nights spent planning this moment. He turned to one of his lieutenants, a wiry man with a clipboard and a determined frown. "We're not done here," the fan said, his voice low, urgent. "Get the word out tomorrow, same time, same place. We keep the pressure on. He'll have to come back eventually." The lieutenant nodded, already tapping out messages on his phone, rallying the troops for round two. The fan's eyes gleamed with a mix of exhaustion and resolve. This wasn't just about Barron anymore. It was about the movement, the message, the world watching. Meanwhile, beyond the park's gates, Barron strode down a quiet side street, his cap still low, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. The roar of the crowd faded behind him, replaced by the distant hum of traffic and the crunch of leaves under his boots. His pulse still raced, the adrenaline of the confrontation lingering like a bitter taste. He could still feel the fan's hands on his chest, the shove that had nearly tipped him over, physically and emotionally. He wanted to push back, to let the anger spill out, but something had held him there, rooted him to that spot until he'd chosen to walk away. He stopped at a corner, leaning against a lamppost, his breath steadying. The fan's words echoed in his head, privilege, indifference, complicit, each one a barb that hooked deeper than he'd admit. He wasn't naive. He knew what his name carried, the history it dragged behind it like a shadow he couldn't outrun. But he'd spent years trying to carve out something separate, something his own. And now this, a stranger with a megaphone, a crowd with cameras, pulling him back into a fight he hadn't started. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a flood of notifications he didn't need to check to understand. The videos were out there now, the argument dissected frame by frame, his every word and gesture twisted into a dozen different narratives. He could already hear the headlines: Trump air clashes with activist, Barron backs down in public showdown. He rubbed a hand over his face, the weight of it all pressing down. Walking away had been the right move. He knew that, but it didn't feel like winning. It felt like a delay, like the storm was still gathering strength. Back in the park, the crowd began to thin, the initial surge of energy dissipating as people drifted toward their days. The fan lingered, his lieutenants organizing the next steps, his gaze fixed on the horizon where Barron had disappeared. He muttered to himself, a promise or a threat. "You'll face it, one way or another." The media crews packed up, their footage already streaming to newsrooms and social feeds, while the last of the onlookers snapped photos of the now empty bench, the flag still fluttering in the breeze. The park settled into an uneasy quiet, but the tension remained, a current just beneath the surface. Tomorrow would bring more voices, more cameras, more demands. Barron knew it, and so did the fan. Their paths had crossed once, violently, briefly, and the collision had left them both changed. The fan's obsession burned brighter, a fire fed by defiance. Barron's resolve hardened, a quiet determination taking root. As the sun reached its zenith, casting harsh light over the city, the stage was set for what came next. The park showdown wasn't the end, it was the spark, and neither man was ready to let it die out. The air in the park buzzed with tension as Barron Trump stepped into view, his hoodie pulled low but not quite hiding the determined set of his jaw. Beside him walked Mia, her presence steady and calm, a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding around them. A small group trailed behind, representatives from a local charity, their expressions a mix of curiosity and cautious optimism. The crowd parted slightly, a wave of murmurs spreading as onlookers craned their necks to see what was happening. Camera flashes popped like gunfire, and reporters jostled for position, their microphones thrust forward like spears. Across the park, the Zelensky fan stood atop a makeshift platform, his green jacket emblazoned with the Ukrainian flag patch catching the sunlight. The megaphone rested in his hand, but for the moment he was silent, his sharp eyes locked on Barron. The banners behind him fluttered in the breeze. Stand with Ukraine, Barron accountability. His growing legion of supporters chanted slogans, their voices rising in a rhythmic swell. He'd spent the morning rallying them, stoking their fervor, and now the stage was set. He'd expected Barron to either hide or lash out, but this was something else. His lips curled into a tight smirk. Whatever the kid was up to, it wouldn't derail his mission. Barron stopped near the center of the park, a small podium already set up by his team. He glanced at Mia, who gave him a subtle nod, her hand brushing his arm in quiet encouragement. The media swarm closed in, a cacophony of shouted questions drowning out the protest chants for a moment. Barron, why are you here? Are you responding to the confrontation? What's your stance on Ukraine? He ignored them, stepping up to the microphone with a calm that belied the storm in his mind. The crowd hushed, an uneasy anticipation settling over the park. I'm not here to fight, Barron began, his voice steady but carrying an edge of resolve. I'm not here to argue or throw punches. What happened yesterday, it's done. But I've been thinking about what it means to use a moment like this for something bigger. He paused, letting the words sink in. The Zelensky fan's smirk faltered, his grip on the megaphone tightening. Barron gestured to the charity representatives behind him. Today, I'm announcing a new initiative, a fundraiser to support youth programs in conflict zones, starting with Ukraine. 100% of the proceeds will go to organizations providing food, shelter, and education to kids caught in the crossfire. This park's going to host the kickoff event next week, and I'm inviting everyone here, protesters, supporters, whoever, to show up and make a difference. A ripple of surprise moved through the crowd. Some clapped tentatively, others whispered to their neighbors, unsure how to react. The media scribbled furiously, already crafting their headlines. Barron's eyes flicked toward the Zelensky fan, meeting his gaze for a brief, charged moment. I'm not hiding, he added, his tone firm. I'm stepping up. The fan's face darkened. This wasn't the confrontation he'd wanted, not the raw, unfiltered clash he'd envisioned. Barron wasn't taking the bait. He was redirecting it, turning the spotlight onto something noble. The crowd's energy shifted, a few protesters lowering their signs, caught off guard by the pivot. But the fan wasn't ready to yield. He raised the megaphone, his voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade. Nice words, Barron, he called out, his tone dripping with disdain. But this doesn't erase anything. You think a charity stunt washes away your family's shadow. You're still dodging the real fight. His supporters roared in approval, their chants resuming with renewed vigor. No excuses, face the truth. Barron didn't flinch. He'd expected this, planned for it even. I'm not here to change your mind, he said into the microphone, his voice unwavering. You've got your cause and I respect that, but I'm not your punching bag. This, he gestured to the charity reps, is what I'm offering, take it or leave it. The park erupted into a cacophony of noise, protesters shouting, supporters cheering, cameras clicking. Mia stepped closer to Barron, her presence a quiet anchor as the chaos swirled. He stepped back from the podium, his message delivered, but the tension hung thick in the air. The Zelensky fan wasn't done. He leapt down from his platform, pushing through the crowd with purpose, his megaphone still in hand. Reporters scrambled to follow, sensing the story was far from over. Barron, the fan shouted, closing the distance. Security tensed, but Barron raised a hand, signaling them to hold back. The fan stopped a few feet away, his chest heaving, eyes blazing with a mix of anger and something deeper, grief maybe, or desperation. You think this ends it. You think you can just throw money at it and walk away. Barron met his stare, his own expression unreadable. I'm not walking away, he said quietly, loud enough for only the fan and a few nearby mics to catch. I'm giving you something to work with. What you do with it is up to you. For a moment the two stood locked in a silent standoff, the crowd's noise fading into a dull roar. The fan's jaw worked, as if wrestling with a response, but then he turned sharply, stalking back toward his supporters. "This isn't over," he muttered, barely audible, but the promise lingered like a storm cloud. Barron exhaled, the weight of the moment settling into his bones. Mia slipped her hand into his, squeezing lightly. "You did good," she murmured. He nodded, but his eyes stayed on the fan's retreating figure. He'd taken a stand, shifted the narrative, but he knew this wasn't the end. The park had become a battleground, and the next move wasn't his to make. As the crowd dispersed, some lingering to argue, others to snap photos, a new headline was already forming in the ether. Barron Trump launches charity amid protest chaos. The Zelensky fan rallied his group, his voice rising again through the megaphone, promising a bigger push tomorrow. And in the distance, the park's trees swayed, indifferent to the human drama unfolding beneath them. The battle lines were drawn, and the war of wills had only just begun. The Miami dawn broke with a fiery orange glow, painting the skyline as the city hummed with unrest. Barron Trump's SUV glided through the quiet back alleys, the engine's low purr a stark contrast to the chants swelling outside his hotel. Miles away, at a modest community center, he stepped out, his 6'7" frame ducking slightly under the awning. Dressed in a plain t-shirt and jeans, he blended into the morning shadows, a deliberate choice to sidestep the chaos he'd left behind. Inside, a small group of charity leaders awaited, unassuming figures in worn blazers, their eyes lighting up as he entered. This wasn't about the activist or the headlines. It was about the youth shelters, a cause he'd championed quietly for years. Barron shook hands, his voice low and steady, redirecting the day's energy into something tangible. "You felt that, didn't you? That was no ordinary moment. If it hit you, hit like and let's keep going." Meanwhile, outside the hotel, the protest pulsed with fury. The Zelensky fan stood at the forefront, his new megaphone clutched tightly, its tinny echo bouncing off the glass facade. "Barron Trump thinks he can run," he bellowed, his voice cracking with exhaustion but blazing with defiance. "He can't hide forever." The crowd, 24 strong, a mix of activists and curious onlookers, waved signs scrawled with demands. "Face us, Barron. No more silence." Their chants grew ragged, fueled by sleepless adrenaline, as news cameras zoomed in, live streams spiking with viewers eager for the next clash. Drones buzzed overhead, their lenses glinting in the rising sun, turning the street into a theater of outrage. The activist's new X account churned with activity, his posts a rallying cry. "He slinks away like a coward. We'll follow him to the ends of the earth." The hashtag hotel protest trended, pulling in thousands of reactions, some egging him on, others mocking his persistence. His allies, a dwindling but fierce band, shared blurry photos of the hotel's empty windows, spinning tailies of Barron cowering inside. But the truth was sharper. Barron wasn't there. He slipped the noose, leaving the activist to rail against a phantom. At the community center, Barron sat at a folding table, a notepad open before him. The charity leaders outlined plans, new beds, mentorship programs, a second location, while he nodded, jotting notes in a precise hand. "We can double the funding if we streamline donations," he said, his tone calm but firm. "I'll match it myself." The room stilled, their gratitude unspoken but palpable. Outside, the world burned with speculation, but here, Barron carved a path away from the noise, his focus a shield against the storm. His phone stayed off, the threats and headlines a distant hum he refused to hear. Back at the hotel, the protest hit a fever pitch. The Zelensky fan paced the sidewalk, sweat soaking his black shirt, the Ukrainian flag emblazoned across his chest now a sodden weight. "He handed me that flag like it was nothing," he shouted, waving a fresh one aloft, its edges snapping in the breeze. "He mocks us all," the crowd roared, but cracks showed, some drifted away, their fervor fading under the relentless sun. A young woman with a megaphone of her own tried to rally them, her voice thin against his. "We need to move, hit him where he's hiding," she urged, but the activist shook his head, his eyes wild. "No, we stay, we make him come to us." Online, the narrative twisted like a kaleidoscope. Clips of the peer's flag handover looped endlessly, now captioned with biting quips. "Barron's 2-0 bros cooked," and Flag Guy's obsession needs a therapist. A viral thread from a supposed insider claimed Barron was spotted at a gym, laughing off the protest false, but it fueled the fire. Trump loyalists praised his evasion as chess master brilliance. Critics sneered at his absence, calling it spineless. Ukrainian diaspora forums buzzed. Some distanced themselves from the activist spiral, others doubled down, framing Barron's silence as proof of arrogance. The memes evolved. Barron as a towering chess king, the activist a pawn toppling off the board. By mid-morning, the protest faltered. Police arrived, their presence a quiet threat, dispersing the crowd with stern warnings. The Zelensky fan lingered, his megaphone dangling, his loyalists reduced to a handful. He sank onto a curb, the flag limp in his lap, his breath heaving as defeat sank deeper. His live stream cut out, the last viewers dropping off, leaving him alone with the echo of his own voice. Across town, Barron wrapped his meeting, the charity leaders beaming as he promised follow-ups. He stepped outside, the sun now high, and inhaled the salt air, a rare flicker of satisfaction crossing his face. But the activist wasn't done. In a cramped basement later that day, he regrouped with his core crew, 5 diehards, their faces gaunt but resolute. A battered laptop glowed on a table, its screen open to a map of Miami. "He's not invincible," he muttered, tracing a finger over the community center's location, a guess based on whispers online. "We find him, confront him again, bigger this time." A wiry man with a camera nodded. "We'll crash his next move, film it raw. No escape." The plan took shape. A guerrilla stunt, a public ambush, something Barron couldn't sidestep. The activist's jaw set, his obsession a live wire sparking anew. Barron returned to the penthouse, the city sprawling below as he leaned against the window. His security chief called, voice tight. "They're digging, sir. Rumors about the shelters, they might show up there next." Barron's eyes narrowed, but he didn't flinch. "Let them come," he said, his tone even. "I'm not hiding." He hung up, the activist's shadow looming larger, not a threat to his safety, but to the quiet he'd fought to keep. The game was escalating, and he knew the next move mattered more than ever. As dusk fell, Miami simmered with tension. Online, #Barron Hunt trended, the activist's cryptic post. "He can't outrun the truth," igniting fresh speculation. News vans circled the community center, tipped off by leaks, while the activist and his crew piled into a beat-up van, their gear rattling in the back. Barron stood at the penthouse window, the ocean dark and endless before him, his mind turning over the day's moves. He won the pier, dodged the hotel, but the war stretched on, relentless and unyielding. The activist's flame burned brighter with each loss, and Barron braced for the fire that would test him again, soon, too soon. The Miami night settled into a deceptive calm as the activist's van disappeared into the distance, its taillights swallowed by the city's restless sprawl. Barron Trump stood by the community center's window, the faint hum of cicadas filtering through the glass. The confrontation had left its mark on the staff, on the space, and on him. His hands were steady as he helped stack chairs, but his mind churned with the weight of what had just transpired. The activist's grudging agreement to consider his offer was a fragile thread, one that could snap with the slightest provocation. But for now, it held. Inside the center, the staff moved quietly, their earlier unease giving way to a tentative relief. The middle-aged woman who'd faced the activist earlier approached Barron, wiping her hands on a rag. "You didn't have to do that," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Step in like that, I mean. We could have handled it." Barron offered a small smile, setting a chair upright. "Maybe, but he wasn't here for you. He was here for me. Letting him tear this place apart wouldn't have solved anything." She nodded, studying him for a moment before returning to her tasks. The center was more than just a building to her, to all of them. It was a lifeline for the kids who came through its doors, a sanctuary carved out of a city that often turned its back on the vulnerable. Barron knew that, and it was why he'd chosen to face the activist here on this ground. It wasn't just about optics, it was about protecting what mattered. Outside, the air was still thick, the humidity pressing down like a blanket. Barron stepped onto the porch, his security detail lingering at a discreet distance. The city lights flickered in the haze, a reminder of the world beyond this small victory. He pulled out his phone, thumbing through messages from his team, updates on the shelters, donor commitments, and a brief note from his assistant. Press caught wind of the stunt. They're asking for a statement. He sighed, pocketing the device. The activists' cameras hadn't been the only ones watching. By morning, the story would be everywhere, spun a dozen different ways depending on who told it. Barron wasn't naive. He knew the activists' truce was temporary, a pause rather than a resolution. The man's demands for accountability, tied to Barron's family name, weren't going away. But tonight, at least, the narrative had shifted. It wasn't just about confrontation anymore, it was about possibility. Back inside, the last of the staff waved goodnight, leaving Barron alone in the quiet. He locked the door behind them, the click echoing in the empty space. For a moment, he stood there, taking in the worn furniture, the posters on the walls, the faint smell of cleaning supplies. This was where the real work happened, not in penthouses or press conferences, but here, in the unglamorous grind of keeping kids off the streets. His phone buzzed again, and this time he answered. "Yeah," he said, his voice low. "Barron, it's me," came the voice of his head of security, clipped and professional. "We've got eyes on the activist. He's back at his base uploading footage. Looks like he's sticking to the deal for now, no inflammatory edits yet, but we're hearing chatter. His crew's split on the offer. Some want to take it, others think it's a sellout." Barron nodded, though the man couldn't see it. "Keep me posted, and get me a read on the press. I'll draft something tonight." "Will do. You heading back?" "Soon," Barron said, glancing around the center one last time. "I've got a few things to finish here." He hung up, crossing to a small desk in the corner. A stack of files sat there, plans for the next shelter expansion, budgets, volunteer schedules. He pulled a chair over and sat, the weight of the day settling into his bones. The activist's words lingered in his mind. "You still need to answer for your family's actions." It wasn't the first time he'd heard it, and it wouldn't be the last. But Barron wasn't here to fight old battles. He was here to build something new. As the night deepened, he worked, the scratch of his pen the only sound in the stillness. Outside, Miami pulsed on, oblivious to the quiet resolve taking root in the community center. The activist might return, cameras blazing, or he might surprise everyone and take the outstretched hand. Either way, Barron would be ready. The story wasn't over. The tension between them was a live wire, sparking with every move. But for now, the center stood intact, a testament to what could be salvaged from the chaos. Barron leaned back, rubbing his eyes, and let the moment stretch. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, press scrutiny, the activists' next play, the endless demands of the shelters. But tonight, he'd held the line. And that was enough. The Miami dawn broke with a humid haze, the sky a bruised shade of gray as the city stirred to life. Barron Trump stood at the penthouse window, the activist's text still burning in his mind. "We'll see." The words were a taunt, a dare, and a promise all at once. He'd replied with defiance, but now, as the hours ticked toward the rally, the weight of his choice settled in. The park would be a crucible, hundreds of voices, cameras, and the activist waiting to see if he'd bend or break. Barron wasn't naive. He knew the odds were stacked against him, but he'd faced worse odds before and come out standing. Downstairs, his team buzzed with last-minute preparations. Clara, his sharp-eyed advisor, paced the room, her phone pressed to her ear as she finalized details with the shelter board. The televised interview was locked in for later that evening, a calculated move to reclaim the narrative after the rally. But first, Barron had to survive the park. He'd spent the night refining his strategy, a delicate balance of concession and control. The activist wanted a confession, a public flaying of the Trump name. Barron wouldn't give him that, but he'd offer something else, something bigger, something undeniable. Clara hung up, turning to him with a brisk nod. "The board on board. They're thrilled about the Ukrainian aid angle, direct support for refugee families tied to the shelter expansion. It's a solid play, keeps the focus on the work, not the politics." "Good," Barron said, his voice steady. "Get the press release ready. We drop it right after the rally, win or lose. And the interview makes sure the journalist knows the ground rules. No family dirt, no gotcha questions. This stays about the shelters. She scribbled a note on her tablet. Done. Security's briefed too. They're expecting a crowd, maybe 500, possibly more if the X-hype keeps building. The activists' crew is already setting up speakers and banners. Barron's jaw tightened. 500. A sea of anger and expectation, all aimed at him. Tell them to keep their distance unless it turns ugly. I don't want this looking like a standoff. Clara hesitated, then nodded. You're sure about this? Going in person? We could send a statement, let the interview handle the rest. No, he said, meeting her gaze. He called me out. If I don't show, he wins by default. I'm not giving him that. She didn't argue, but the worry lingered in her eyes as she left to coordinate with the team. Barron turned back to the window, the city sprawling below like a chessboard. The activist had moved his pieces. Now it was Barron's turn. By noon, the park was a cauldron of noise and heat. The activist followers filled the open space, their signs jabbing at the air. No excuses. Trump must answer. A makeshift stage stood at the center, draped in Ukrainian flags and strung with microphones. The activist himself paced behind it, his lean frame taut with energy, his eyes scanning the crowd. His crew flanked him, some loyal, some visibly uneasy, but the momentum was his. The rally had drawn more than supporters. News vans lined the perimeter, their cameras trained on the stage, while onlookers milled at the edges, drawn by the spectacle. Barron arrived in the SUV, parking a block away to avoid feeding the narrative of privilege. His security detail fanned out, discreet but present, as he stepped onto the grass. The crowd noticed him almost instantly, a ripple of shouts and murmurs spreading like wildfire. He wore no tie, no jacket, just a plain white shirt and jeans, a deliberate choice to strip away the Trump sheen. This wasn't about his name today, it was about his actions. The activist spotted him, a flicker of surprise crossing his face before it hardened into a smirk. He grabbed a microphone, his voice cutting through the din. Well, look who showed up. Barron Trump, ladies and gentlemen, here to face the music or just to spin more lies. The crowd erupted, some cheering, others jeering. Barron kept walking, his expression calm but resolute until he reached the edge of the stage. He didn't climb up, not yet. He stood there, hands in his pockets, letting the noise wash over him. I'm here, he said, loud enough to carry without a mic. You wanted me to show, I showed, now what? The activist leaned forward, his eyes blazing. Now you answer. No dodging, no PR tricks. You said you'd work with us, prove it. Tell these people what your family did, how your name, tied to the war they're fleeing from. Give us the truth or this deal's off. The crowd roared, the demand echoing in their chants. Truth, truth, truth. Barron felt the pressure like a physical weight, but he didn't flinch. He'd expected this, planned for it. He raised a hand, waiting for the noise to dip just enough. I'm not here to play your game, he said, his voice steady, cutting through the chaos. I'm not my father, my brothers, or anyone else. I'm here because those shelters, those kids need help. You want accountability? Fine. I'll give you action instead. The activist scoffed, but Barron pressed on, stepping closer to the stage. Starting today, the shelter initiative's expanding. We're partnering with Ukrainian charities, direct aid for refugee families here and abroad. Food, housing, support. No politics, no excuses, just results. You can join me or you can keep screaming into the wind. Your call. A murmur ran through the crowd, some nodding, others hesitating. The activist's smirk faltered, his grip tightening on the mic. That's it. Money and promises. You think that washes the blood off your hands? It's not about my hands, Barron shot back. It's about theirs. He gestured to the crowd, to the signs, to the flags. You want to help them or you want to keep fighting me, because I'm not the enemy here. The activist opened his mouth to retort, but a new sound cut through, a sharp crack, then screams. The crowd surged, panic rippling as a plume of smoke rose from the park's edge. Barron's security team moved instantly, one of them grabbing his arm. Smoke bomb, the man barked. We're pulling you out." "No," Barron said, pulling free. "Not yet." He turned back to the stage where the activist stood frozen, his crew scrambling. The smoke thickened, shouts turning to coughs as people scattered. Barron climbed onto the platform, grabbing a fallen mic. "Everyone stay calm," he shouted, his voice rough but firm. "Get to open ground away from the smoke. We're not done here." The activist stared at him, caught off guard, as Barron took charge, directing the crowd toward safety. Sirens wailed in the distance, police and medics converging on the scene. The rally had spiraled into chaos, but Barron didn't waver. He stayed until the last of the stragglers moved clear, then stepped down, his shirt streaked with sweat and soot. The activist followed, his face a mask of fury and confusion. "This changes nothing," he spat, though his voice lacked its earlier edge. "You don't get to play hero and walk away." Barron met his gaze, unflinching. "I'm not walking away. The offer stands. Help me make this work or keep chasing ghosts. Up to you." He turned, heading for the SUV as his team closed ranks around him. The activist stayed rooted, the crowd thinning behind him, his moment of triumph swallowed by the smoke. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every second Barron's stand, the chaos, the unresolved clash. Back at the penthouse, the team scrambled to assess the fallout. Clara met him at the door, her tablet alive with updates. "The smoke bombs all over the news. Cops think it was a rogue protester, not planned. You're trending. Half the headlines call you a leader, half say you dodged the real fight. The activist's quiet for now, but his followers are split." Barron nodded, sinking into a chair. "The interview's still on." 8 p.m., she confirmed. "You've got 2 hours to clean up and prep. The shelter board's ready to back the refugee aid announcement. Details are locked." "Good." He rubbed his face, the adrenaline fatting into exhaustion. "Let's finish this right." The rally had been a gamble, and the smoke bomb had nearly tipped it into disaster. But Barron had held the line, turned the activist's trap into a chance to show what he stood for. The interview would seal it, lay out the plan, keep the focus on the shelters, and leave the activist to decide his next move. Outside, Miami simmered under the weight of the day, the park now a ghost of its earlier fire. The tension between Barron and the activist crackled on, a live wire stretched taut. The story wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for now, Barron had claimed the narrative, one hard-won step at a time. The Miami night stretched out before Barron Trump, the city's skyline a constellation of lights pulsing with restless energy. From the penthouse balcony, he watched the world below, his hands resting on the cool metal railing. The rally had been hours ago, but its echoes still reverberated in his mind. Olna's voice, the activist's faltering rage, the crowd's shifting tide. The televised interview had looped endlessly on every news channel, dissecting his every word, but Barron had muted it all. The headlines didn't matter, the work did. His phone buzzed again, another update from Clara. Donations still climbing. Ukrainian community leaders reaching out for partnerships. You've started something big. He let out a slow breath, the weight of the day settling into his bones. It wasn't triumph he felt, not yet, but a quiet resolve. He'd face the fire and come out the other side, not unscathed, but stronger. The question now was what came next. Across town, in a dimly lit apartment, the activist, whose name he'd later revealed to a journalist was Mykola, sat hunched over a chipped wooden table. The Ukrainian flag lay folded beside him, a silent sentinel. The rally footage played on his cracked laptop screen, Olna's words cutting through the static of his thoughts. Honor it by helping, not by hatting. He'd spent years nursing his anger, channeling it into protests, pamphlets, and megaphone rants. It had fueled him, defined him. But tonight, that fire felt like ash in his mouth. He opened a browser, hesitated, then typed, Barron Trump Youth Initiative. The screen filled with articles, shelters in Miami, aid shipments to Kyiv, plans for vocational training in conflict zones. Mykola's jaw tightened. It wasn't enough to erase the past, he told himself. It couldn't be. And yet Olna's face lingered in his mind, her strength, her loss, her plea. He closed the laptop, the room falling into shadow. Tomorrow he'd decide. Tonight, he let the silence sit. The next morning, Barron stood in the lobby of a nondescript office building, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Clara had arranged a meeting with a coalition of Ukrainian expatriates and refugee advocates, spurred by the rally's fallout. He adjusted his tie, a rare formality, and squared his shoulders. This wasn't a photo op or a speech. This was the real work. Olna was there, seated at the head of a conference table, flanked by a dozen others, teachers, doctors, survivors. Her presence grounded the room, her voice steady as she introduced the group. "We saw what you said yesterday," she began, her eyes meeting Barron's. "We want to know what you'll do." Barron didn't flinch. "I'll listen," he said simply. "Tell me what you need, what works, what doesn't. I've got resources, but you've got the experience. This isn't about me. It's about getting it right." For hours they talked, logistics, funding, outreach. Barron scribbled notes, asked questions, nodded at stories of resilience and ruin. Olna spoke of schools bombed out in Donetsk, of children who'd forgotten how to dream. A doctor described makeshift clinics under shellfire. A teacher outlined a plan for remote learning hubs. Barron didn't promise miracles, he couldn't, but he pledged what he could: money, manpower, a platform. As the meeting wound down, Olna approached him, a faint smile softening her features. "You're not what I expected," she said, "but you're here, that's a start." Barron returned the smile, small but genuine. "I'm learning as I go. Thanks for giving me a chance to." That same afternoon, Mykola stood outside a community center in Little Havana, a flyer crumpled in his hand. It advertised a volunteer drive for Barron's initiative, packing aid boxes for Ukraine. He'd seen it pinned to a bulletin board at a coffee shop, the words "Help, Don't Hate" scrawled in marker at the bottom. Olna's words again, haunting him. He stepped inside, the room buzzing with activity, boxes stacked high, volunteers sorting clothes and medical supplies. A woman handed him a clipboard, no questions asked. "Glad you're here," she said. "We need all the hands we can get." Mykola worked in silence, tapping boxes, folding blankets. His mind churned, anger warring with doubt, pride with pragmatism. He didn't forgive the Trumps, didn't trust Barron's motives entirely. But as he watched a pallet of supplies load onto a truck bound for Kiev, something shifted. This wasn't absolution. It was action. A familiar figure caught his eye: Barron, sleeves rolled up, hauling a crate alongside a teenage volunteer. Their eyes met briefly, a flicker of recognition passing between them. No words, just a nod. Mykola looked away, returning to his task. It wasn't peace, but it was a truce. Weeks later, Barron stood on the balcony again, the city quieter now under a blanket of stars. The initiatives were gaining traction, shelters opening, aid flowing, partnerships solidifying. The media had moved on to fresher scandals, but the work pressed forward. He'd carved out a space, not as a Trump heir, but as Barron, flawed, determined, his own man. His phone lit up with a text from Clara. "First shelter in Kiev operational. Olna says thanks." He closed his eyes, letting the moment sink in. The weight of his name still pressed down, but he carried it differently now, with purpose, not shame. Somewhere across the city, Mykola pinned the flag back on his wall, its colors vivid against the peeling paint. He joined the volunteer roster, not as a convert, but as a skeptic testing the waters. His fight wasn't over, justice still burned in him, but it had a new shape, one forged in action, not just words. The story didn't end with a grand reconciliation or a fairy tale flourish. It ended with two men, once at odds, stepping onto parallel paths, building, questioning, moving forward. The clash had faded, but its ripples spread outward, touching lives neither could fully see. In the quiet, Barron whispered to the night, "One step at a time," and the world, ever restless, turned on. If you enjoyed this story, there's another video on screen right now. Go ahead and give it a look for an even more astonishing tale. And don't forget, we'll have many more uplifting and dramatic stories coming your way. So make sure you subscribe to our channel, that way you'll never miss our newest uploads.